Hello everyone, welcome to the 8th week of this massive open online course on Sociology of Development. We have completed 7 weeks of this course in terms of 17 lectures. This is going to be the 18th lecture of this course. If you look at this, in the first week we have discussed historical location of the idea of development within quote. In the second week we have discussed decolonization, rise of nationalism in the third world and the desire for development. In the third week we have discussed classical sociology and the notions of social change, ideas of evolution and progress. In the fourth week we have discussed modernization theory through the lens of, through the works of Hamza Alawi. In the third week, we have discussed classical sociology and the notions of social change, ideas of evolution and progress. In the fourth week, we have discussed modernization theory through the lens of, through the works of Hamza Alawi. In the fifth week, we have discussed modernization theory through the works of Eli. In the sixth week, we have discussed modernization theory through the works of, through the lens of Theodore Sanin. And then in the seventh week, we have discussed critiques of modernization theory. And in the eighth week and in the ninth week, we are going to discuss dependency theory through the works of Blomstrom and Hetny. Okay. And in the 10th week we will discuss critiques of dependency theory. Okay. Now, as you know that we are in the 8th week of this course and we are going to move away from the modernization paradigm, which postulates that the less developed economies would eventually catch up with development provided they emulated the economic and social systems of Western capitalism. Okay. Now, and we have discussed the critiques of modernization theory in terms of critical variable approaches and dichotomous approaches. I mean, critique of the dichotomous approaches to modernization theory, as we have discussed. I mean, there is a threefold critique that we have discussed. The ideological critique, the empirical critique, and the methodological or meta-theoretical critique. Okay? And we have also discussed how by focusing largely upon variables relating to indigenous aspects of social structure and culture, how the proponents of modernization theory have either underestimated or ignored many important external sources of or influences upon social change. Even modernization theorists who emphasize the role of the Western impact in modernization tend to look at this impact only in terms of its consequences for the diffusion of the particular cultural attributes, ignoring the structural mechanisms of the interactions between societies. And that's how I told you that one must read the interpretation of cultures by Clifford Geertz. Limitations of such perspective are particularly evident. I mean, limitations of the modernization paradigm are particularly evident when applied to the new states of Asia, Africa and Latin America, whose emergence did so much to stimulate the development of modernization theory. Okay. We have discussed how tradition and modernity represent two mutually exclusive and functionally interdependent clusters of attributes and so on. Okay. I mean, then we are going to look at the Latin American critique of modernization theory in the context of, I mean, the famous phrase that Andre Gunder Frank, one of the proponents of, or rather the principal architect of dependency theory, suggested: development of underdevelopment. Okay. Dependency theory, when I say it, emerged as a set of theories which maintained that the failure of the third world states to achieve adequate and sustainable levels of development which resulted from their dependence on the advanced capitalist world. Dependency theories developed in opposition to the optimistic claims of modernization theory, which saw the less developed countries being able to catch up with the West. They stressed that Western societies had or the colonizers, the imperialist forces, had an interest in maintaining their advantaged position in relation to the less developed countries and had the financial and technical wherewithal to do so. A variety of different accounts about the relationship between the advanced capitalist countries on the one hand and the less developed countries on the other evolved within the broader framework of dependency theory, ranging from the stagnationism and surplus trend theory of Andre Gunder Frank, which predicted erroneously though that the third world would be unable to achieve significant levels of industrialization, to the more cautious pessimism of those who envisaged a measure of growth based on associated dependent relations with the West. We are going to discuss associated dependent relations when we will be discussing at length and in detail this one, the dependency theory. As a prefatory remark, let me tell you that the major contribution to dependency theory was undoubtedly that of Andre Gunder Frank, a German economist of development who devised and popularized the phrase the development of underdevelopment, describing what he saw as the deformed and dependent economies of the peripheral states, in his terminology the satellites of the more advanced metropolis. Satellite means periphery, satellite means periphery or less developed countries, underdeveloped countries, and metropolis means core, center, advanced capitalist countries, developed countries and so on. Okay? In Capitalism and Underdevelopment in Latin America, which Frank published in the year 1969, argued that the third world was doomed to stagnation because the surplus that it generated was appropriated by the advanced capitalist countries through agencies such as transnational corporations. Frank himself insisted that growth could only be achieved by serving ties with capitalism and pursuing autocentric socialist development strategies. And in this context, the dependency theory was flawed by an overemphasis on economic factors and in some versions a necessitarian logic based on the idea of a surplus drain. When I say surplus drain, I mean extraction and appropriation of profits. Okay? That such extraction and appropriation of profits may emanate from squeezing labor, may emanate from the less developed countries, okay, to the rich and powerful nations. Nonetheless, it had the merit of drawing attention to the international dimension of development and brought the power relations between states under scrutiny. The emergence of the newly industrializing countries as a group of successful late developers challenged the validity of the core assumptions of dependency theory, demonstrating that successful late industrialization was possible under certain circumstances and suggesting the need for a more sophisticated and disaggregated approach to third world development. Having provided you with such prefatory remarks about dependency theory, if you look at dependency theory, I mean development of underdevelopment and so on, what you will find that it is like this. If this is the core or center, okay, it's like this, that labor or raw materials, okay, they always come from periphery or the less developed countries or the satellites. Okay. If you look at this, okay, it is like this. Okay. Core or the metropolis or the developed countries or the advanced capitalist countries, in turn they supply finished goods to the less developed countries or the periphery or the satellites. Okay. Then in a way the periphery across the continents, especially Asia, Africa and Latin America, they always supply cheap labor force, raw materials at a throwaway price or maybe free when there was colonialism to the core, to the metropolis, and in turn they receive finished goods from the metropolis at a much higher price. Okay. That is how you will find that there is a perennial dependence on the advanced capitalist countries by the less developed countries. Okay. The dependency approach originated in the extensive Latin American debate on the problems of underdevelopment, which was a most valuable contribution to modern social sciences. Not only did dependency approach contain an effective criticism of the modernization paradigm, it also provided an alternative perspective and still functions as a catalyst in the development theory which is taking shape at present. The dependency school emerged from the convergence of two intellectual trends, one often called Neo-Marxism and the other rooted in the earlier Latin American discussion on development that ultimately formed the ECLA tradition. I mean, it is popularly known as ECLA tradition, I mean United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America. Okay. To start with, why we are mentioning Neo-Marxism and so on, or ECLA tradition, Neo-Marxism differs from Marxism in the context of critique of positivism, critique of economism and the inclusion of culture industry. If you slightly recall, in the context of Theodore Sanin's reflections on class, state and revolution, the empirical peasantry and the hypothetical proletariat, we have discussed how Marxism tends to look at industrial working class as having the potential to bring about social political revolution, and on the contrary, the proponents of Neo-Marxism, they suggest that no, it is based on the subjective conditions, okay, because conditions cannot be absolutely objective, there will be subjective conditions, and if the conditions are subjective, then it may be it may depend on the peasantry who can bring about a social and political revolution. And they tried to look at the examples of China or Cuba and so on. Okay. That is why the concept of Neo-Marxism reflects a certain dualism in Marxist thinking. On the one hand, the traditional approach, when I say the traditional approach, it refers to Marxism. Okay. That focuses on the concept of development and taking a basically Eurocentric view. And on the other hand, a more recent approach, this more recent approach is nothing but Neo-Marxism. That focuses on the concept of underdevelopment and expressing a third world view. I mean, when Marxism tried to look at development, and by looking at development, it tries to look at European experiences about development. Neo-Marxism tries to look at underdevelopment by looking at the countries of the third world. Okay? And of course, you will find that if this is so, that there are certain differences between Marxism on the one hand and Neo-Marxism on the other. Of course, much controversy has arisen as to the continuity or discontinuity of these two approaches. To the orthodox Marxists, the main body of Neo-Marxist thinking is more or less incompatible with the classic Marxist work, and this complex issue will be made simpler through the lectures as we make progress in the course. A second important background to the dependency school was the more indigenous Latin American discussion on underdevelopment, reflecting specific economic and intellectual experiences in various Latin American countries, particularly during the Great Depression from 1929 to 1933. And this economic crisis dramatized the dimensions of Latin American dependence. It initiated a more systematic economic research, and it necessitated a policy of import substitution, later systematized into a development strategy. If we add to this the early works of the Argentinian economist Raul Prebisch, we have the background story of ECLA, a story that forms the subsequent lectures to follow, and then we'll also have Latin American critique of the modernization paradigm, and such critique is is an integral part of those theoretical trends that have led to the dependency approach. Okay. Now, what we are going to do, we are going to look at in this lecture, what we are going to do, we are going to look at Marxism versus Neo-Marxism. When I say, I mean Marx and the third world. There are four vantage points through which we are going to discuss. 1. Marx and the third world. 2. Marxism in Latin America. 3. The new left in Latin America. And 4. Paul Baran and the rise of Neo-Marxism. What we are going to do, I mean the way he made a distinction between actual surplus and potential surplus. Okay. And then we will discuss the differences between Marxism and Neo-Marxism from 4 vantage points in terms of imperialism and nationalism, classes, revolution and ethics, and ecology. Okay. When we come to the point of Marx and the third world, it would be absurd to apply Marx's description and conclusions about 19th century European capitalism to the so-called problems of the underdeveloped countries of today. It would be equally absurd to blame Marx for the futility of such an undertaking. In this context, let us treat Marxism as a system of thought which has been mechanically applied to the problems of underdevelopment. Our purpose is not to criticize Marx or glorify Marx, but to point out that the intellectual development in the third world has been greatly influenced by the fact that Marxism as well as a number of other systems of thought was introduced as an ideology rather than as a theory. Before the Russian Revolution, Marxism was mainly represented by a few often poorly translated publications. The subsequent large-scale distribution of Marxist literature was more a matter of political zealousness than a response to intellectual demands. This is not one of the attempts to look at the history of Marxism, but it is important to the development of the dependency school, particularly since the dependency school was a reaction against schematic orthodox Marxism and analytical weakness and political inefficiency of orthodox communism. In one of their more pamphleteering moods, Marx and Engels stated that the future of the backward country is reflected in that of the more developed country. Through the rapid improvement of the instruments of production and vastly improved communications, the bourgeois forces all nations, including the most barbarian ones, into civilization. The low prices of goods is the heavy artillery with which it shoots down all Chinese walls, and the means by which it forces the capitulation of the barbarian stubborn hate of foreigners. All nations are forced to adopt the bourgeois mode of production unless they want to be ruined. It forces upon itself the introduction of so-called civilization that is becoming bourgeois. In other words, the bourgeois creates a world in its own image. Marx's thoughts about the problems of underdevelopment did not differ significantly from the prevailing 19th century evolutionism, development optimism. The third world rested peacefully and unsuspectingly like a sleeping beauty waiting for the Western world's Prince Charming to awaken the process of development, if not by a kiss, then by the sword. In one of the most frequently quoted passages of the non-European world, Marx foresees an industrial revolution in India as the inevitable result of the English-built railways. What he wrote that you cannot maintain a net of railways over an immense country without introducing all those industrial processes necessary to meet the immediate and current wants of railway locomotion, and out of which there must grow the application of machinery to those branches of industry not immediately connected with railways. The railway system will therefore become in India truly the forerunner of modern industry. What Marx wrote about Asia, apart from the draft of a theory about the Asiatic mode of production, was mostly pure journalism. Influenced by the news of the day, Marx himself considered it to be based on news items. His writings on Asia therefore offer little information to the reader interested either in Asia or the history of Marxist thinking. However, the fact that there are so few of them makes them difficult to ignore. One of the key concepts in this context is the Asiatic mode of production. In Marx's extremely tentative formulation, this concept is of little value as a description of India or indeed the rest of Asia. Nevertheless, it offers an important insight into the nature of Marxism itself. Since the latter published work on pre-capitalist social formations, which included a discussion on the Indian mode of production, clearly documents a multilinear view of development. The most remarkable aspect of Marx's analysis of the Asiatic mode of production, however, is the fact that he considers it to be devoid of dynamics, which therefore in a way legitimizes colonialism. Marx, as well as most other contemporary European intellectuals, no doubt viewed this slumbering society somewhat disdainfully. In formulating the concept that he intended to add to Hegel's analysis of the superstructure, that is Oriental despotism, by providing his own analysis of the base, that is the Asiatic mode of production. Marx's writings about the Asiatic mode of production were thus based on old European tradition of thought around the subject of Oriental despotism. At first, it was feared and respected. But as the Turkish Empire declined, what you will find that these sentiments changed into disdain. Turkey was the first model, but as the knowledge about Asia grew, the concept moved eastward. Marx's contemporaries knew quite a lot about India, or a little about China and very little about Japan. When speaking of Asia, Marx mostly meant India. The same basic attitude is found when he does explicitly mention China. The general decline, which was the result of the opium trade in China, for example, is dealt with in the following drastic terms. What Marx wrote, that it would seem as though history had first to make this whole people drunk before it could rouse them out of their hereditary stupidity. Marx and Engels refer sparingly to Latin America in their extensive production. The references they do make are strongly Eurocentric in nature and deal exclusively with politics, such as, for example, the Mexican-American War of 1847, which Engels thought of as a fortunate and historically progressive incident. For such a country to be dragged into historical activity by force is indeed a step forward. And it is in the interest of its own development that henceforth Mexico should be placed under the tutelage of the United States. Marx agreed all the vices of the Spaniards, boastfulness, quixotism, and grandiloquence are found in the Mexicans. Okay, that's how from Mexico we are coming to Latin America. Marxism in Latin America. If you look at this, Marx's own writings thus provided a poor basis for a genuinely Marxist analysis of the economic conditions and the class struggle in Latin America. European immigrants had introduced socialist ideas during the later part of the 19th century, but they bore the mark of anarchism rather than that of Marxism. In Latin America, as well as in most other parts of the third world, Marxism was spread through the Communist International, the Comintern. The first Comintern Congress, which specifically dealt with Latin American questions, was the sixth, held in 1928. What Clissold wrote way back in 1970, that the Comintern's declaration on Latin America, which also initiated the hard line. In Latin America, the communists must everywhere actively participate in the revolutionary mass movements directed against the landlord regime and against imperialism, even where these movements are still under the leadership of the petty bourgeois. In so doing, nevertheless, the communists may not under any circumstances politically subordinate themselves to their temporary ally. Whilst struggling for the hegemony during the revolutionary movements, the communist parties must strive in the first place for the political and organizational independence of their parties, securing its transformation into the leading party of the proletariat. During the period between 1928 and 1935, People's Front policy, the Comintern enforced its ultra-left line, characterized by a revolutionary puritanism which refused to collaborate with any bourgeois elements. The Nicaraguan Sandinista guerrilla, for instance, was severely criticized. This line was totally unsuccessful, with the exception, of course, of deteriorating relations between the Soviet Union on the one hand and Latin American governments on the other. The softer line introduced after 1935 lasted until the dissolution of the Comintern in 1943. As a result of it, the communist parties in several countries eventually turned into significant political forces. Most often, however, they remained as minority groups of little or no political importance. They rarely produced thinkers of any significance, although maybe in the context of Peru, I mean Mariátegui, Jose Carlos Mariátegui, what he wrote 7 essays on the Peruvian reality, written in 1927, remains the single most important attempt to understand a national Latin American problem in a Marxist perspective. In order not to give the impression that early Latin American communism was unjustly scanty, Mariátegui's 7 essays on the Peruvian reality must be discussed. What he did, he described the history of Peru in a dialectical perspective, from the hunting and gathering economy of the Incas to the socialism of some future age. Mariátegui claimed that the Spanish conquest had meant a retardation to feudal institutions, and that the subsequent capitalism had been perverted partly by the foreign economic influence and partly by the domestic alliance between the bourgeois and the aristocracy. According to Mariátegui, the proletariat was in fact the primitive Indian population. The new Peru was to be built on the latter's collectivist traditions. His homespun nationalistic Marxism, somewhat reminiscent of Mao Zedong or Gandhi's Hind Swaraj, Gandhi's Khadi homespun cloth, was consistent with the Comintern lineup until the tightening of the reins in 1928. After that, he turned into an eccentric in an increasingly streamlined communist movement. Towards the end of his life, Mariátegui became more and more isolated. His revolutionary nationalism led him to support Hayati Latour, the populist leader of the APRA, Alianza Popular Revolutionary America, revolutions in America. Later, Mariátegui became convinced that the Alianza Popular Revolutions in America would follow the example of Kuomintang in China, which was quite an astute prediction. Look at Moscow, for example, Peruvian Socialist Party, for example, and the case of Cuba is also a good example of the contrast between the orthodox Communist Party line and a more voluntaristic revolutionary strategy. Urged by the Comintern and aided by the Mexican Communist Party, the Cuban Communist Party was founded in 1925. Cuba already had a militant non-Marxist radical nationalism with Jose Marti as its central figure. Marti had led the insurrection against Spain in 1895 and fell in combat. Those who claim that Fidel Castro was influenced more by Marti than by Marx are probably right. The Great Depression of the 1930s created great social problems in Cuba, when the economy was strongly dependent on the United States of America. In 1933, Batista led an insurrection against the dictator Machado. Batista enjoyed extensive popular support, although not by the Communist Party, which was illegal until 1938. Led by Blas Roca, the Communist Party played an important role in the labor movement. After 1935, when the Comintern proposed a popular front policy, the party sought allies in other groups of the left and eventually ended up supporting Batista. In return, he not only legalized the party but promoted 2 leading communists to ministerial posts. The party changed name in 1944 and became the Partido Socialista Popular. Between 1938 and 1944, the membership had grown from 23,000 to 1,22,000. In 1952, Batista's dictatorship moved towards the right and the Communist Party was again made illegal. In 1959, Fidel Castro began the revolt, which was carried out entirely without the support of the Communist Party. The course of events of the revolt is well known. In December 1956, 82 revolutionaries landed in Cuba from the boat Granma. 19 of them reached the mountains, Sierra Maestra mountains, and began the guerrilla war, which led to Batista's fall a few years later. From a conventional communist view, the Latin American society was still feudal in nature, and a mobilization of the proletariat would therefore be premature before Latin America had experienced its own bourgeois revolution. In other words, it was the historical task of the growing bourgeois to smash the feudal imperialistic alliance. That feudal imperialist alliance, when I say, a task in which the proletariat was to participate. Only then would a socialist revolution be possible. The two-stage strategy, the Cuban revolution challenged this political view. Pre-Cuban phase was like this, indicative of the situation of the communist parties in this period, and a key to the internal and external conflicts that were overwhelming them was their scant participation in the most important events of the movement. Not in Guatemala in 1944, in Bolivia in 1952, or in Cuba in 1959, nor in any of the political convergence in Venezuela, Argentina, Colombia, or Peru did the communists play an outstanding role. In conclusion, it might be said that the role of Marxism in Latin America was marginal until 1960. With the exception of certain political development, political movements, maybe in Chile, and certain individuals like Martigues. Around 1960, the movement suffered from yet another schism as a result of the Sino-Soviet conflict. The conflict between the then Soviet Union on the one hand and the People's Republic of China on the other. In spite of the Chinese challenge, to which should be added the criticism from various Trotskyists, Castroists, and nationalist communists, and the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968, the Latin American communist parties have remained amazingly faithful to the Soviet Union. In terms of development strategic thinking, they have been very close to the ECLA analysis. We are going to discuss ECLA, United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America, in the next lecture. But when you look at when the ECLA strategy ran into difficulties during the 1960s, they were also subjected to criticism from the dependency school. One of the best known dependency theorists, we have discussed André Gunder Frank, had this to say about Latin American communist parties. The Latin American communist parties and their ideologues have made no contribution to Marxism and other story or any other theory that anyone has been able to discover. Programmatically, they have been scarcely as advanced as the bourgeois developmentists, from whom they differed at most in their largely Soviet inspired and propagandist opposition to American imperialism. Politically, they have been little more than a tail wagged by the national bourgeois dog who used the communist parties temporarily, excepting in Guatemala, Venezuela, and Colombia. To keep a leech on the dependence theorists, the communist parties at home and abroad loyally joined the opposition. That is what Frank wrote in 1977. Coming to the new left in Latin America, during the 1960s, Latin American political science developed into something entirely different from what the official communist analysis had predicted. The peasants were more inclined to revolt than the industrial working class, and the rural guerrilla appeared to be an alternative to organizational work within the labor movement. The traditional Marxist views were consequently subjected to severe criticism from the left. Furthermore, there was now a Marxist inspired debate that did not necessarily have any connections with the Communist Party. The underlying political reason for this may be sought in the Cuban Revolution, and this revolution should not have been possible according to the conventional Marxist view, and at the beginning the Cuban Communist Party saw Fidel Castro as a bourgeois adventurer. His success as well as the breakthrough of Che Guevara's revolutionary appeals in other parts of the Latin American continent undermined the Communist Party's positions and forced them into a more or less radical re-evaluation of their earlier policies. What Aguilar suggested that the repercussions of these events naturally went beyond the Cuban sphere, okay? That it went beyond the Cuban sphere. It is evident that many of the arguments that were hurled directly or indirect or obliquely at the old Cuban communist cadres, the bachelors of Marxism, as they were disrespectfully called by Che Guevara, could very easily be applied to nearly all the communists or communist parties of the continent. Che's ideas about the role of the peasants in the revolution and the ability of the human will to surmount objective limitations is reminiscent of Mao Zedong. Latin American Marxism became even more fragmented after the Sino-Russian conflict, and Maoist ideas were allowed to grow freely, as was a less party-bound Marxism. Particularly at the universities, Marxism now became a part of the intellectual climate rather than just a stilted language at Communist Party conventions. The new left had been born. The new left was impatient in a way. It wanted revolution here and now. The culmination of this political line was the Latin American Solidarity Conference held in Havana, the capital of Cuba, in August 1967. Its motto was, "The duty of a revolutionary is to make revolution." The influential Venezuelan Communist Party objected violently to the fact that Fidel Castro had assumed the task of deciding who was and who was not a revolutionary in Latin America. Other communist parties were, however, moderate in their views. The Secretary General of the Chilean Communist Party noted two tendencies in the revolutionary movement in Latin America: a proletarian one and a bourgeois nationalist one. The bourgeois nationalist underestimated the role played by the working class and showed a tendency towards anti-socialism, but was nevertheless revolutionary. Only imperialism could profit from a polarization of these two tendencies. Allende's front organization was made possible through this more moderate attitude. When Che was killed by the Bolivian army and a month later the guerrilla theorist Debre was sentenced to 30 years of imprisonment, this was the beginning of the end of the voluntarist revolutionary strategy. Fidel Castro's support to various guerrilla groups became more selective. After this, it becomes necessary to make a clear distinction between Cuban political views, which gradually grew more consistent with Soviet foreign policy, and Guevarism. The People's Army, that is the guerrilla army, is capable of winning a war against a regular army. It is not necessary to wait for the objective conditions for the revolution to develop. They can be created by the guerrilla army, which thus becomes an embryonic revolutionary center, and the armed struggle in the underdeveloped countries should primarily take place in the rural areas. Okay. All of these points were contrary to the long-standing communist line in Latin America. Although Che in his later speeches and writings often emphasized the importance of a Marxist-Leninist party, particularly for the socialist construction work, there was a lingering ambivalence when it came to formulating the theoretically correct relation between the rural guerrilla organization and the urban party organization. And this ambivalence has of course been the source of a number of disagreements, purges and schisms in the Latin American communist parties. The disagreement about Foucault and party, about the continental extent of the revolutionary struggle, the relative importance of the rural and the urban guerrilla, and the question of support to popular front movements or governments, to mention a few. Nevertheless, there is no reason for elaborating on the further development of Guevarism in Latin America, and its more important aspects should now be obvious. During the late 1960s, the somewhat fossilized communist movement in Latin America saw Guevarism as a great theoretical and ideological challenge. Many dogmas were rejected, new questions were asked, and the conditions for a more Latin American Marxism were created. And in this context, Paul Baran's The Political Economy of Growth of 1957 assumes greater significance, and therein lies the significance of Paul Baran and the rise of Neo-Marxism. This ideological development coincided with the development of Neo-Marxism at the more academic level. It is no easy task to analyze the relationship between these two approaches. However, it is obvious that they supported each other. Okay? Let us therefore leave the brutal political reality and take a look at the intellectual preparations made in the usually more relaxed atmosphere of the university. Here, Paul Baran's The Political Economy of Growth of 1957 must be given credit for contributing significantly to the upsurge of the New Left and Neo-Marxism. In his analysis of the political economy of development, Paul Baran used the concept of actual surplus and potential surplus. Okay. In his analysis of the political economy of development, Paul Baran used the concept of economic surplus. I mean that economic surplus, very conventionally speaking, it refers to only actual surplus, but what he examined, Baran examined how it had been created. Economic surplus had been created and utilized in different social systems. The surplus was simply defined as the difference between production and consumption. This actual surplus is equal to production minus consumption. Furthermore, he distinguished between actual and potential surplus. Potential surplus is defined as the difference between the production that would be possible in a given geographical and technological environment on the one hand, and that which may be considered to be necessary consumption on the other. Baran admitted that this concept was primitive, but it had the great advantage of being relevant. It provided insight into the irrational elements of an economic system and underlined the need for an analysis of the obstacles to a mobilization of potential resources. Paul Baran used the concept of potential surplus in his analysis both of developed and underdeveloped countries, but as the course demands, Sociology of Development demands, we will be focusing our attention to underdeveloped countries or less developed countries. According to Paul Baran, capitalism had sprung from feudalism, which in its final stage of dissolution was characterized by increasing agricultural production, by a more extensive division of labor, and by capital accumulation. And these processes were all prerequisite to capitalism. Western Europe had led this development by its geographically advantageous position and by its lack of natural resources, which stimulated trade, shipping and pillaging, plunder. For various reasons, this process was not developed in the Third World. Plundering the colonies may not have increased the European national income by much, but what Baran argues but it did constitute a significant contribution to its economic surplus, hence also to investment and economic growth. The colonies' economic surplus consequently diminished, their capital accumulation came to a halt, and their budding industries were killed by competition. In other words, development in the colonies was forced off its natural course and was now completely dominated by imperialistic interests. The countries of the Third World, of course Japan is an exception here, stagnated somewhat somewhere between feudalism and capitalism, semi-feudal and semi-capitalist modes of production, and were the victims of the worst of both systems. The Marxist view of the spread of capitalism differed radically from Marx's own views. Baran abandoned the view of capitalism being spread from the center to the periphery. Instead, he introduced the idea that underdevelopment was an active process following the development in the center. This because how the metropolis have made development possible only by making underdevelopment possible in the third world. And such view, which constituted a clear break with classical Marxism, was more or less hinted at or implicit in Paul Baran's analysis. It was brought to its logical conclusion in the works of Andre Gunder Frank, in which the idea of the development of underdevelopment was brought forward. The third world, the less developed countries, seemed to be doomed to perpetual underdevelopment. No capitalist development tendencies seemed to undermine the feudal social structure. In fact, Latin America, along with the rest of the world, rest of the third world, were de facto capitalist from the very moment they were incorporated in the capitalist world economy. The Latin American bourgeois was parasitic and would therefore would never fulfill its historical mission of freeing the productive forces. The Neo-Marxist view prescribed immediate revolutionary activity based on guerrilla tactics instead of the communist two-stage strategy. This is where the Guevarist influence comes in, Che's influence comes in. Thus, the Neo-Marxists both theoretically and practically favored a new line which at that time seemed to be in better agreement with the political realities than the orthodox Marxist one. Neo-Marxism was thus the academic expression of that for which the guerrilla struggle stood at the practical political level, a point which was often emphasized. Here one must understand the expression of an interpretation which was so different from the prevailing Latin American Marxism that it is not without justification to speak a change of paradigm in relation to Marxism and above all in relation to established theories of development. When I say established theories of development, established Marxism, the established Marxism of course is more problematic as compared to established theories of development. The paradigmatic cleavage between the two schools is primarily characterized by a lack of communication. This criterion is relatively well met in the case of the modernization perspective versus the underdevelopment perspective, and the line between Marxism and Neo-Marxism is much less clear, and the distinction per se has also subjected to some criticism. An authoritative view claims that Marxism is whole and indivisible, and that the Neo-Marxists have either misunderstood some basic Marxist thesis, or they should not be thought of as Marxists at all. The concept of Neo-Marxism will probably not survive for long, and we merely use it as a heuristic concept to indicate a specific stage in the history of Marxism, during which there were great gaps in the Marxist analysis of the problems of underdevelopment, and therein lies the significance of the differences between Marxism on the one hand and Neo-Marxism on the other. At this point, it might be interesting to take a closer look at an attempt to identify the phenomenon of Neo-Marxism and the differences between Neo-Marxism and Marxism. We are going to discuss the differences between Marxism and Neo-Marxism through 4 vantage points, namely imperialism and nationalism, classes, revolution and ethics, and ecology. Marxism, as interpreted by Lenin, sees imperialism in a centered perspective, that is, as a stage in the development of capitalism, that is monopoly capitalism. That is why Lenin said, what is the highest stage of capitalism? No, imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism. Neo-Marxism on the other hand sees imperialism from the peripheries or the victim's point of view, which in turn implies that the interest has shifted from development to underdevelopment. This break with what is for the classical Marxism such a typical evolutionary perspective is quite important to the distinction between Marxism and Neo-Marxism. Marxist inspired leaders of the third world such as Mao Zedong and others have often had a nationalistic appearance, which has always been more acceptable to Neo-Marxists than orthodox Marxists. Okay? Coming to classes, here we find several important differences. The Marxist analysis of classes is based on specifically European experiences, while that of the Neo-Marxists is based on the revolutionary struggle in the third world, with a much more generous view of different groups' revolutionary potential. Okay? Whereas Marxists have difficulties seeing anyone but the industrial proletariat, industrial workers as the revolutionary class par preference, the Neo-Marxists tend to let the peasantry play this role. They have, peasantry has got the revolutionary potential, claiming that the industrial workers of the third world in reality form a labor aristocracy. And Marxists believe in the existence or eventual emergence of a national bourgeois in the third world, whereas Neo-Marxists see the bourgeois as the creation and tool of imperialism and as such incapable of fulfilling its role as the liberator of the forces of production. Coming to revolution and ethics, the Neo-Marxists view the possibilities of starting a revolution with greater optimism, with 19th century development optimism, 19th century evolutionism, even if the conditions may be unfavorable, and in this context emphasize the importance of guerrilla warfare. Marxism, on the other hand, emphasizes organization and peasant party work, particularly amongst the industrial workers. In other words, Neo-Marxists emphasize the role of the subjective factors, moral stimuli, the new individual, the new man and so on, and Marxists retain materialism and the emphasis on objective conditions that gave Marx his distinctive mark as a social scientist. Coming to ecology, Marxism still shows the traces of the 19th century development optimism, and many Marxists consider the concept of scarcity to be a bourgeois invention for the purpose of legitimizing economic inequality. Some Neo-Marxists now integrate the growing ecological consciousness and the demands of environmental movements with their theory of development, sustainable development and so on. The blind faith in industrialism as the liberator of humanity has at the same time undergone some major revisions. Similarly, there is now a tendency to think of the cities as being parasitic and to idealize the countryside, contrasting sharply with Marx's own comments on the idiocy of rural life. The Neo-Marxist concept has caused considerable irritation amongst Marxists, and obviously these differences which we have pointed out, namely imperialism and nationalism, classes, revolution and ethics and ecology, are merely rough indications of general tendencies. On this basis, it might be difficult clearly to define two theoretical camps with contrasting but internally identical views. It might be said that Neo-Marxism has accepted the changes through which Marxism has passed after its transplantation from European to non-European soil, while the Marxists have been anxious to safeguard the purity of Marxism. Instead, what we are witnessing today, we are witnessing a dialectical intellectual process in which Marx is the thesis and perhaps Neo-Marxism has become the antithesis, that is a phase in the universalization of the Marxist tradition. And this is the way in which we are using these concepts, using the differences between Marxism and Neo-Marxism through these four vantage points, and the theoretical deficiencies in orthodox Marxism with regard to its analysis of the social conditions in the third world are now being mended and its gaps filled. And what we have discussed today, we have discussed dependency theory, how it has evolved over a period of time, how the dependency approach originated in the extensive Latin American debate on the problems of underdevelopment and so on, and how the dependency school emerged from the convergence of two intellectual trends, namely Neo-Marxism on the one hand and the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America, popularly known as ECLA tradition, on the other. And then we have discussed Marxism versus Neo-Marxism through 4 vantage points, I mean Marx and the Third World, Marxism in Latin America, the New Left in Latin America, Paul Baran and the rise of Neo-Marxism, I mean Paul Baran's concept of economic surplus, and then how he made a distinction between actual surplus on the one hand and potential surplus on the other. And then we have discussed the differences between Marxism and Neo-Marxism through 4 vantage points, namely imperialism and nationalism, classes, revolution and ethics, and ecology. And in the next class, what we are going to do, we are going to discuss ECLA, I mean United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America, development thinking through Raul Prebisch and ECLA, programmed industrialization, the ECLA theory of development, and so on. And then we must try to discuss the Latin American critique of the modernization paradigm in the lectures to follow. Thank you.